The guitar hero Eric Clapton, who is admired for his serene manner and fluid, bluesy riffs, now speaks out about Ginger Baker, one of the most erratic and contentious people in rock history. In addition to his legendary skill behind the kit, the legendary Cream drummer was notorious for his ferocious temper, unrelenting ego, and a decades-long string of disputes. Clapton's remarks are like a lightning strike. Fans who had always viewed Baker not because of the mayhem around him but because of his innovative music were shaken. Another rock star was not Ginger Baker. He was a man who flourished in the storm's eye, generating it when none was there. His life was a symphony of genius and devastation, an unrelenting quest for perfection entwined with emotional upheaval, fierce feuds, and a tendency towards self-destruction that left even his closest allies worn out. The combination of Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce, and Eric Clapton reinvented what a rock band might be when they first appeared on the scene in 1966. Beneath their blues-influenced works, however, was an uncomfortable partnership. The band was propelled forward like a thunderstorm by Baker's unrelenting drumming, but his attitude was a completely different force. Unpredictable, violent, and frequently uncontrollable. Imagine the tension in the recording studio as Baker's frantic, controlling style clashed with Clapton's reserved, reflective demeanor. As a man who appreciated accuracy and self-control, Clapton was always at odds with Baker's erratic energy. Baker's caustic tongue was used to strike out at anyone who dared to question his authority, making every jam session a battleground. The scenes backstage weren't any better. Clapton was driven to the brink by Baker's increasing drug usage and his unrelenting need to control every facet of the band's creative process. Exhausted by the drummer's erratic behavior, Clapton started to wonder if the emotional toll was worth the magic they produced on stage. Despite all the chaos, Baker's brilliance was indisputable. His polyrhythmic drumming was the driving force behind Cream's ascent to rock legend. If Clapton had a hard time with Baker, Jack Bruce and Baker were at war. The two musicians, who were both exceptionally talented, hated one another with a fervor that frequently descended into violence. Legendary altercations that transcended music broke out between Baker's contempt for Bruce's bass playing and Bruce's annoyance with Baker's controlling demeanor. In one notorious instance, Baker and Bruce almost got into a brawl on stage during a live concert, and their discussions turned into near fistfights backstage. Bruce's stubbornness to back down only served to fuel Baker's renowned fury. Clapton was caught in the crossfire, unable to stop the devastation, as the rivalry became so fierce that it led to the early dissolution in 1968. Baker publicly criticized Bruce for years and rekindled their quarrel whenever he could, carrying his animosity for him like a grudge engraved on his soul even after Cream's death. Their relationship remained a ticking time bomb even though they occasionally got back together. Baker continued to be combative after Cream. He strained relationships with some of the top musicians over his career. His time with Clapton and Steve Winwood's supergroup, Blind Faith, was brief, mostly because of his domineering personality and unwillingness to make concessions. The project could not proceed because of the tensions caused by Baker's concern with being the dominant force. Outside of bands, Baker had disagreements with other drummers, especially ones he thought were less talented than him. He is renowned for dismissing performers like Led Zeppelin's John Bonham, calling their playing overrated bashing. His reputation as one of rock's most challenging characters was further cemented by his harsh criticisms, which caused him to become estranged from many of his colleagues. Baker fought with jazz greats like Art Blakey, despite his admiration for the genre, since he consistently asserted his dominance and refused to accept the influence of other drummers. He has turned down opportunities and partnerships that could have further enhanced his career because of his preoccupation with being the best. Ginger Baker's struggles extended beyond his well-known conflicts in the music industry. His private life was a never-ending spiral of regret, suffering, and devastation. A guy battling to reassemble the pieces of a life destroyed by drugs, rage, and bad choices was hidden behind the ferocious drum solos and combative public demeanor. His constant battle against himself frequently resulted in the breakdown of his relationships, whether they were with wives, kids, or friends. Picture the scene. There was so much tension in the room that it could break, and Baker was slumped in an armchair with a cigarette hanging from his lips. Once full of passion and promise, his marriages fell apart under the constant pressure of his erratic temper and propensity for self-destruction. Each of his 4 marriages started out with optimism but ended in a recurring cycle of mayhem. Emotional scars that would not go away, fights that turned into yelling contests, and repeatedly violated promises. Attracted to the mysterious brilliance, his wives soon found themselves caught in a vicious circle of unrest, having to put up with his erratic behavior, extravagant spending, and addictions that overcame his better judgment. The wreckage did not spare his children. A tragic illustration of Baker's incapacity to sustain emotional stability was the tense relationship he had with his son, Kofi. As a drummer who continued his father's legacy, Kofi frequently felt the sting of Baker's unrelenting criticism rather than his endorsement. There were 10 instances of estrangement, disappointment, and distance for every instance of fatherly pride. Because of Baker's obstinate refusal to accept his shortcomings as a parent, years of animosity grew between them like an insurmountable wall. Baker's financial life was as careless as his personal life, even though he made millions working with Cream and on other ventures. Like grains of sand, money went through his fingers and was wasted on rash investments, costly desires, and a luxury lifestyle that he was never able to maintain. There were lawsuits, terrible business dealings, and growing debts waiting on the other side of every check received from album sales and royalties. Consider the Dream Ranch in South Africa, where Baker felt he might finally find serenity and where he found refuge and escape. Persuaded that it would be his haven from the outside world, he threw everything into it. However, his incapacity to handle finances and his escalating health issues resulted in catastrophe. He was left emotionally and financially heartbroken when he was forced to sell the property due to mounting debt. Baker's financial difficulties turned into public scandals rather than merely being a personal hardship. He was portrayed as careless and reckless in court cases involving creditors and former managers. Filings for bankruptcy started to appear often. More of the legacy he had worked so hard to create was being taken away by each one. In a devastating decline from grace that many believed was unavoidable, the towering symbol of rock's glory was suddenly a man fighting to keep the lights on. Baker's hard-living lifestyle had taken a toll on his bones as well as his profession and income. He had degenerative osteoarthritis as a result of years of smoking, abusing heroin, and playing an aggressive drumming technique that beat his body into submission. A state that made even the simplest motions excruciating. Once a tool of unadulterated rhythm and strength, his body was now a prison of agony and immobility. But, being Baker, he obstinately refused to get assistance for years. He dismissed family and friends' worries, disregarded medical advice, and maintained that he could still play in spite of his deteriorating condition. Even though his hands were shaking and his legs were giving way beneath the pressure, he persisted because he was too proud to acknowledge his weakness. Imagine the once ferocious drummer now confined to a chair, his eyes clouded with frustration and his hands clenched in anguish. Even though he was hardly able to walk on his own, the guy who had controlled the stage with a primal force still had a burning need to create, perform, and regain what his body had taken from him. The fact that Ginger Baker was his own worst adversary, however, may have been the most sad element of his personal hardships. Those who cared for him the most were driven away by his blazing temper, unwavering stubbornness, and reluctance to accept assistance. After growing tired of his erratic behavior, friends and associates finally turned away, leaving Baker to deal with his problems on his own. The ghosts of his previous broken relationships, lost chances, and irreparably destroyed bridges tormented him. He expressed remorse, but he rarely took responsibility for them, preferring to vent his anger onto the people he believed had mistreated him. Baker's life served as a warning that even the most exceptional abilities might be undone by one's own harmful impulses. One thing was certain in the midst of all the commotion. One survivor was Ginger Baker. His greatest strength and ultimate downfall were his determination in facing his problems. He remained steadfast in his conviction that he was fundamentally a drummer, an artist, and a warrior despite his deteriorating health and financial collapse. Although his personal hardships may have obscured his accomplishments, they also made him more relatable and exposed the complexity of the legend. Baker's narrative is one of tragedy and genius, of living life to the fullest without regret or apology, only the unrelenting pursuit of his craft at any costs. Beyond family issues and addiction, Baker's life was replete with scandals that solidified his status as one of rock's most divisive personalities. His notorious threats against bandmates, his violent outbursts with journalists, and his legal issues, which included financial fraud and tax evasion, made headlines for years. Baker was a man who seemed incapable or unwilling to break out from the destructive cycle he established, and he thrived on conflict. Baker's temper never subsided, not even in his old years. Interviews turned into battlefields, with Baker snapping at fans, other bands, and reporters. His legacy was clouded by the very battles he refused to leave behind, and he spent his last years in self-imposed isolation. Ginger Baker's influence on music is indisputable, even in the face of the chaos. He transformed drumming by fusing jazz, African rhythms, and rock in a way that had never been done before. He raised the bar for drummers in all genres with his technical prowess and unafraid innovation. His legacy, however, is one of paradoxes. He was a brilliant man whose creativity was only surpassed by his demons, and whose genius was frequently eclipsed by his destructive inclinations. Baker's life was both turbulent and revolutionary, and Eric Clapton's disclosures about him barely touched the tip of the iceberg. A reminder that ability, no matter how great, is frequently insufficient to overcome the personal challenges that define us as provided by Ginger Baker's narrative. He is still regarded as a legend, but the wounds of war and unrealized potential will always be a part of his legacy.